I'm 29 and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lived just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip, though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there, you can see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly, before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I walked around it, enjoying the scenery, then pitched the tent and set up my camp on the tree line beside the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept turning around, hearing soft noises somewhere between the trees behind me. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was really creepy. It almost sounded exactly like footsteps, but I knew nobody would be out here. I would have seen their tent when I walked around the lake. It was too dark at this point to see anything further than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option anymore. An hour later, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I would hear footsteps again. They were barely too quiet for me to tell for sure what they were, though. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell asleep. And what I think was only an hour after I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I jolted up and grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the tent and looking in the direction of the footsteps. I saw the bare back of them running away in the distance. My heart was beating rapidly. I looked down and saw footprints all around my tent, like they had been walking around me and searching the campsite. I tried to get the campfire going again as fast as I could so I could see better. I was terrified. I had nowhere to go and nobody to help me. I sat at the fire all night, keeping my head on a swivel, but I never saw or heard anything else. In the morning, I snapped a few pictures of the lake, then started the hike back. I had planned to stay for a whole day. I wasn't comfortable anymore, feeling like I was being followed. I was able to make it back without any more trouble, thankfully. But, along my journey, I began noticing several things missing from my backpack. Small things like food, a few tools, etc., but I always had my bag with me. Even today, I wonder if whoever had been outside my tent that one night had actually snuck inside and stole from my bag while I was asleep. Even the thought of it makes my whole body shiver. I've always loved camping, especially in the fall when the leaves are changing colors and the air is crisp. So, when my best friend, who I'll call Katie, asked me to go camping with her for her birthday, I jumped at the chance. We packed up our gear and headed out to a secluded spot in the woods that Katie's family had been camping at for years. As we hiked in, I felt a sense of silence. In a good way, though. It was like we were the only two people in the world. The hike was relatively short, and when we arrived at the campsite, we both started working on setting everything up. This only took a portion of the hour, and after we finished, we decided to go for a hike. We went pretty much straight north, off the beaten path, just exploring, until we came across a faded trail. Katie had never seen it before, and said there was nothing out here, so she was confused. We followed the trail that wound through the woods and eventually led us to what looked like an old abandoned cabin. It was small and weather-beaten, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Katie was eager to explore it, and I was a bit hesitant, but also really curious. We stepped inside. It was clear that no one had been there for years. We poked around for a while, looking for any interesting artifacts or clues about who had lived there, but we didn't find anything. As we were about to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the corner of the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. It was very small and had a padlock on it. I pointed it out to Katie, then we both became curious. The lock looked really old, completely rusted all over. I knocked on the door, knowing nobody would be inside, but I just wanted to make sure. Katie went outside and grabbed a large rock, handing it to me. I smashed it against the lock, only taking a few good hits until it broke open. The door dragged against the ground and we pulled it back. Inside, it was pitch black and we couldn't see anything. Katie pointed her flashlight through the doorway, and there was a staircase leading down. We both were creeped out now, but we assured ourselves that nobody has been here for years and there really wasn't anything realistic to fear. I led the way down the steep staircase. It wasn't very long, only 8 to 10 steps, before it opened into a room. What we saw was very disturbing and strange. There were several small mattresses on the ground, along with some other random furniture. They looked very modern though, like the mattresses had to be within 5 years old. Something about it just hit me with fear, and both of us rushed upstairs. We pushed the door shut again and stood there, unsure of what we just saw. We debated whether or not it was a crime scene of some sort, because it all just looked so out of place. As I was talking, Katie suddenly shushed me. In the distance, footsteps were coming toward the cabin. They came all the way up to it, but oddly, they walked right past it without stopping. I could see confusion on Katie's face too. As soon as they were far away, we ran back to our campsite, then right back to Katie's place. We called the police, just in case it was something. To us, the fact that the person kept walking without even stopping meant that they were familiar with the cabin. We didn't know if it was due to something bad or not, so we decided to let the police decide. They searched the cabin and the area around it, but ultimately found nothing leading to anything. They said it was really strange, and even seemed like it had to be something bad, but there just wasn't anything justifying that. It ended up becoming a big thing in our town for a while, having the community talk about every possibility and theory of what the cabin was used for. The city even had the cabin torn down because they didn't want people visiting it. It still has never been figured out, and it probably never will, but there's just something in me that knows something awful happened there. Every year as a kid, my family would go on these big camping trips. I was always really excited because we lived in Arizona, where there's pretty much nothing, and we'd camp in Washington. Seeing trees and grass was my favorite part, but I also got to see all my cousins, and even though we only saw each other a couple times a year, we were really close. My favorite cousin, who was more like a brother to me, was Luis. He was a year older than me, and we were inseparable when together. Because of what happened, we became even closer after that camping trip. I think it took us both a while to understand what really went on and what more could have happened to us. It started when we had been there for 2 days already. Most of our family was either in the lake or by the campfire talking. Luis didn't like to swim, so we decided to play in the woods instead. We played a version of tag called Bandit. We'd switch off being the cop and chase the other one, who was the bandit, until we catch them. We would play for hours, but in the woods, it's easy to just keep running and not know where you're going. We tried our best to stay within viewing distance, but when Luis started chasing me with a huge stick, I guess my adrenaline kicked into hyperspeed. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, I ended up at an old-looking trailer. Luis wasn't far behind, but I remember him throwing the stick down, his focus now on what we both assumed was an abandoned trailer. We discussed investigating it further, and I'm not really sure why, but we decided not to. We started walking back, but we didn't really know where we were going. Probably about 10 minutes into our walk, we saw a couple coming towards us, pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. The woman approaches us and is really nice, while the man stayed back. She asked if we were lost, who we were with, our names and ages. And I remember when we told her how old we were, she looked back at the guy and then to us again. She told us we don't have to be scared, and she'll help us find our way home after they drop off their stuff at their campsite. She said we could also make s'mores if we wanted. Luis and I were hesitant, but she seemed really nice, and it was still daytime, so for some reason that made everything way less suspicious. In my 7-year-old brain, bad people only do things at night, so we were fine. We walked with them for a while, following them back to their camp. While her and Luis were talking, I glanced over at the shopping cart. It was filled with a bunch of rusty metal things, and what looked like to be nothing new. Nothing was in bags. Everything just looked like trash they'd found somewhere. I started to get really uncomfortable, and I could tell Luis was too. Every time I'd look over at the guy, he was never smiling, and sometimes he'd be staring at me with a blank stare. This was 18 years ago, and I still remember how creepy he looked. We walked a bit further until the trailer came back into view, and the woman grabbed Louisa mine's hand and asked if we were excited for s'mores. Suddenly, I heard Louisa's name being called, and then mine. We all stopped for a second, and the lady squeezed my hand a bit tighter. She asked something to the guy along the lines of what they should do. He responded, but I don't remember what he said. The lady started to turn us toward the trailer while holding us tighter and tighter. She started to speed up as well into sort of a fast walk. I looked back and saw my sister through the trees. Without hesitation, I yelled her name, and the lady immediately let go of my hand. Louise and I ran to her as she made her way towards us. My sister yelled to the others that she'd found us. My mom and dad thanked the couple who had told them this elaborate story on how they've been trying to find our parents for a while now, and that we're such sweet boys and everything. I remember my parents inviting the couple over for burgers, but thankfully they declined. I think because the lady was so nice and that we were found safe, that my parents didn't think twice. I do recall my dad and uncle talking about how creepy the guy was, though. My cousin and I ended up telling my sister, who found us, that the couple was weird, but I don't think she understood what we meant. It wasn't until my cousin and I were old enough to understand that some people have really bad intentions. We talked about it again in depth, and we both came to the conclusion that by the looks of it, they were tight on money, and were probably going to sell us or something. For years growing up, I had kept this from my parents because I was supposed to be the strong man of the family, and thinking about that time made me feel gross and preyed upon. Luis also felt embarrassed, as he was older than me and felt he had failed to protect me. We eventually told our parents a few years ago, but I wish we had told them immediately, and maybe something could have been done. Nowadays, I never let my kids out of my sight, and always let them know that they can tell me anything without fear of being judged, especially my son. I was out camping in a familiar forest in Colorado. I lived a couple hours away, but came out every couple months when the weather was nice. I'd already had my camp set up and was there for 2 full days. I spent those days getting the tent situated and going fishing, not really doing much else. On the 3rd day, though, I set out on a hike just north of my campsite. There were no trails out there, so I was just going partially up the mountainside in a general direction. I knew all the landmarks near my camp and had all the necessary equipment to make sure I didn't get lost, so I was just enjoying the walk. It was probably a little past midday at this point, and as I walked further up, I noticed a column of smoke coming from behind me. It almost looked like it was coming from right by my campsite. I walked around to try and get a better view, and as far as I could tell, there was something burning either at my campsite or somewhere in the close area. I quickly made my way back, worrying about what it could be, but I knew that I hadn't left the fire going, so I really had no idea. Once I got about a quarter mile away from the base of the smoke, it became more apparent that it wasn't directly from my camp. I made it back to confirm, and nothing was wrong with anything. The smoke was coming from somewhere very close, though, just far enough into the trees for me to not see anything. I thought about going and seeing what it was, but the only thing it could be at this point was someone else's campfire. It was strange that someone happened to be out here in the exact place I was, because again, there were no trails leading to this specific spot, but I definitely didn't want to run into some random people out here, so I stayed in my camp. I didn't really think much else on it. I just went on with my day and did some other things around the camp. Probably an hour passed before I casually looked around and felt my body stiffen when I saw a man standing in the forest. It was so unexpected, and the way he was standing seemed like he was just looking at me. Being so oblivious, I had no idea how long he'd been there. I lifted up my arm and did a nervous wave, but the man didn't wave back. He was too far to see if he was actually watching me, but he was definitely facing toward the campsite. After a minute, I went back to what I was doing, but I kept my eyes up and checked every now and then, and the man stayed in that same spot for almost 15 minutes before he was finally gone. That had really creeped me out. There just didn't seem to be any reason for someone to be acting like that. I waited a few hours, watching my surroundings the whole time, before walking over to where I'd seen the man standing. I wanted to see if there was something there that might have had his attention, but I didn't see anything. It was just another part of the forest. I went back to my camp as the sun was beginning to set. I tried to tell myself there was nothing, and I was overthinking all of it, but the more I really thought about it, the more I got creeped out. By the time the sun had fully set, I still hadn't seen anything else though. I was sitting right outside of my tent and got the fire going. I don't know how long I was out there for, at least an hour, before I noticed the flickering light to my left. It was from another campfire out in the forest close by. Oddly, it wasn't in the direction I'd seen the smoke coming from earlier in the day though. It was near where I'd seen the man. I stood up, now feeling that unnerving sense building up in me again. Looking closer, I could actually see the base of the campfire, but it didn't look like anyone was around it. I moved my eyes around the dark forest, carefully scanning the entire area, and as my eyes moved around, I saw something else. Behind a bush, only 10 or 15 feet away, I could see a face looking back at me. My heart stung from the immediate stress and fear that ran through me. For the few seconds I looked at them though, it seemed like the figure didn't think I could see him. He was definitely looking back at me, but remained completely still. I took a few steps back, standing behind my campfire and keeping my eyes locked in the direction of the man. The most terrifying 30 minutes of my life passed extremely slowly before I saw the figure begin moving back, making his way further into the forest. They stayed crouched and moved slowly all the way back until they were fully covered by the dark in the trees. I remained with my eyes wide open and shifting around in all directions for the whole night, not seeing anything more. Once the sun was lighting up the forest enough, I packed up and headed out, walking as fast as I could until I made it back to my car. Whatever was going on out there was far too suspicious, and something told me that staying there any longer would only put me at risk of finding out the extent to their likely harmful intentions. I'm a 26-year-old male, and this happened last year. I was taking a vacation alone, and one of my friends owned a cabin near the area I was planning on visiting. It all worked out really well and saved me a ton of money, which I was super grateful for. This cabin that they owned I'd never been to, but I'd heard my friend talk about it a lot and I'd seen pictures. It sounded like the most cozy and relaxing place in the world, and that's exactly what I wanted out of this vacation. It was very isolated, I'd say about 40 minutes outside of the closest town, which felt pretty far from me, though a lot of that time was due to it being located on a dirt road that you'd have to drive really slow on. Anyway, when I arrived, I must have spent a whole hour just standing outside and looking off in the distance, enjoying the nature and quietness. Afterwards, I made an early dinner and was on my phone for a while, then decided to use up the rest of the daylight with a short walk. There were several small trails right next to the cabin that I'd noticed when I was standing out there. I texted my friend to make sure they were actually trails and wouldn't get me lost, but he assured me that I had nothing to worry about. He said the closest one to the back of the cabin was just a straight line through and out of the woods. That sounded perfect to me, so I put on some walking boots and started down the trail. It wasn't the smoothest walking trail, but it wasn't all that bad either. It definitely wasn't anything I could get lost on, and that was my only real concern. I walked for probably just under half an hour, looking at the nature around me and letting my mind wander, until I heard something that confused me enough to get me to stop. But as soon as I stopped, it went quiet. Then, just a moment later, I heard it again, a man's voice speaking loudly with a harsh tone. It sounded somewhat far, though. I looked at the woods around me, trying to locate where the man was. I heard him speak again, somewhere far off to the right of the trail, but I still couldn't see him. It sounded like he was talking to someone, though, or yelling at them. I didn't want to leave the trail, but something about this made me think there was something wrong. I didn't know if any other cabins or houses were out here, so there was no way for me to really know if it was unusual for anyone to be by this trail, but them not being on the trail made it strange. I listened for another couple minutes, hearing the man several times speak angrily towards something. It wasn't in English, so I couldn't understand him, and strangely, nobody ever responded, at least not loud enough for me to hear. Eventually, I decided to walk a bit closer to try and see who was there. I didn't want to make myself known, I just wanted to be sure that nothing crazy was going on. I was careful to not lose sight of the trail as I walked deeper into the woods, but once I got closer, all of the talking and yelling stopped. After a moment, I started to get really uneasy and jogged back to the trail. Everything going on just gave me the sense that I was in danger, and being out in the woods was probably the last place I wanted to have that feeling. The sun was beginning to come down as well, so that was my cue to get back to the cabin. I walked quickly, and just a couple minutes down the trail, I heard leaves crunching from the woods. I jolted my head around, but shadows casting from the trees made it difficult to see clearly. It sounded like someone was running behind me from somewhere out in the woods, not too far away. I turned around and ran the rest of the way to the cabin, getting inside and locking everything up. I looked out the back window and immediately saw a man walking toward the cabin. He was wearing a thick hoodie and had something in his hand. In a quick and desperate moment, I made the decision to grab my keys and run for my car at the front of the cabin. I got in and drove off, not seeing anyone follow. After talking with my friend, he made it clear that nobody should have been out there. What that man was doing or who he was yelling at is unknown. But if I had stayed in the cabin, I probably would have never been seen again. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of U.S. citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. My friend and I lived in a small town outside of Seattle, and for the prior few years, we'd both gotten really into camping, hiking as well, but there was something about setting up a camp and just living out there among the wildlife that hit differently. When this happened, it was spring of 2021. We had planned out a typical camping trip not far away, but with our schedules at work being a little mismatched, it took a bit of finessing to figure out a good few days to go. In the days leading up though, my manager had to push back my requested days off by a day, which messed everything up. I told my friend, who I'll refer to as Brandon, and he said it was alright since it was just a day off, saying he'd hike out there and set up camp and just spend the first night alone. He insisted on it and said he'd enjoy it, so who was I to stop him? He let me know when he got there and set everything up, and it all seemed good. On the following morning, I drove out and started making my way to the campsite. This wasn't really a common place, mainly because there were so many other campsites around, but it still had a well-made trail in a cleared-out site that was made for campers to stay at, so it wasn't just some random spot in the forest. I texted him while I was on my way, but lost service before I was able to receive anything back. During the walk, though, there were several times where my phone had gained a bit of service, and I still hadn't gotten a text back. I thought maybe he was having service issues, or possibly it was something wrong with my phone, but basically there were a million reasons why I didn't get a text back, so I wasn't too surprised. But once I got to the camp, something was missing. Brandon. I checked the tent in the nearby areas, but he wasn't anywhere. I still wasn't too worried. I knew there was a few places around that he could have gone, a nearby river for fishing, and a couple trails with nice views. He really could have been anywhere. I put my bag down and set up my tent, then got a fire going to heat up some canned food I'd brought with. It was only noon, so if he had gone to the river or down a trail, he probably wouldn't be back until 3 or 4. But once 5 rolled around, I started to get nervous. I tried to see if I could make out any shoe prints to show which way he may have went, but honestly I had no idea. There were a ton of shoe prints all over the area that had no clear direction. My phone had no service still, so there weren't many options for me to go out and find him. My only logical choice was to stay where I was and just hope he came back. Hiking out when the sun only had another 30 minutes of light left was just asking for a disaster. I put some more wood into the fire and sat down, hoping for the best, but uncontrollably fearing the worst. I didn't know if he'd gotten hurt, lost, or was just enjoying himself on a hike. And that's when I saw a light flash by a few trees ahead of me. It moved around like someone was walking with it, and it was near one of the trails. I felt some relief, thinking it had to be Brandon. It came closer, getting brighter and even close enough for me to hear footsteps in the distance. But then all of a sudden, right before I thought I'd see who it was, it shut off and the footsteps stopped. "Brandon," I called out. It was silent, no movement or response. My stomach tightened and I called out again, "Brandon, who's out there?" It remained silent, furthering the disturbing gut feeling I had. To make it all worse, I stared into the darkness, waiting and listening for over an hour, hearing absolute silence aside from the sounds of the woods. I never heard the person leave, but I could feel that he was still out there watching me. I got up and started packing my things, going quickly while still watching my back. Something in me just told me to get out of there and find help, so that's what I did. I don't think I was followed, as I made it out without any more incidents, but police weren't able to help me until the following day. We went back out there, finding everything how I'd last seen it, but Brandon was still gone. They tracked him, going off one of the trails and deeper into the woods, showing another set of shoe prints right next to his. Unfortunately, Brandon never turned up, and the whole thing went cold after a couple days. It's believed that he was likely taken by the person that was out there with him, and that was likely the same person I'd encountered. It's just terrible thinking about whether things would have ended up differently if I had been able to go with him on the first day, or if I too would have gone missing. That's it. My girlfriend and I always enjoyed going for weekend camping trips pretty frequently. We used to live right inside the Appalachian region in Virginia, so obviously we'd find new places on or near the Appalachian Mountains. Both of us had pretty stressful work lives during the weekdays, so getting out in nature and staying away from home on the weekends really helped us. At the time this happened, we had already been on dozens of camping trips in the Appalachian Mountains, but none of them had ever ended like this. It was Saturday morning, and we decided on a very small 3-mile trail that leads to a nice isolated camping ground on a flatter part of the mountain. We had never been to this specific spot before, but from the amount of reviews the trail had on Google, we assumed it was a pretty well-known trail and campgrounds. We got our bags ready and packed the truck with our camping gear, and then we made our way out there. It was only a 45-minute drive from our house, but as we got closer it began raining quite a bit. This was pretty normal around the mountains here, so we were used to being out in the rain, and it didn't bother us enough to turn around. We pulled up to the trailhead, which was actually just off the side of the road, and we saw one other car parked on the side. We actually expected there to be more people considering the popularity of the trail, but we were glad it wasn't crowded. Though, as we started getting our gear out, my girlfriend pointed out that the parked car's passenger door was cracked open a few inches. We both looked around to see if the owner was nearby, but with no signs of them, I decided to go over and push it closed, as we assumed the owner must have accidentally left it open. The whole passenger seat was soaked from the rain already, but at least it wouldn't get any worse. I came back to our car to grab my stuff, and then we both started making our way down the trail. We talked about how weird it was that the door was open, and how most people would probably notice that their car wouldn't even lock due to the open door. It's worth mentioning, too, that it was clearly a pretty expensive newer car, which just made it more strange. Anyways, the rain started picking up at this point, so we began walking faster so we could get to the campsite and set up our tent. I want to say it took us about 2 hours to get to the end, as it was mostly uphill. Once we were there, the first thing we noticed was a tent already set up in the middle of the flat area. It was pretty small, definitely a one-person tent. We figured they were probably in there sheltering from the rain, so we went to a far corner on the site and set up our tent there. We sat inside for an hour, eating some food we brought and laying some of our stuff out to dry, before hearing voices outside. The rain hitting the tent was too loud to hear what they were saying, so I unzipped the front and looked out. I jumped a little bit as there were two men kneeling down and looking at us from just a couple feet away. But then they smiled and introduced themselves. They said they were staying in the tent in the middle and that they'd been here a few days. I quickly introduced my girlfriend and I and told them that we were just here for the night. Then they headed back and I zipped up our tent and looked at my girlfriend. The whole interaction seemed a little off, and they seemed to be acting a little strange. I noticed that both of the men were wearing tightly fitted jeans and regular t-shirts, and their tent was way too small to be fitting two full-grown men. It really just didn't seem like they were here camping or hiking, and definitely not for a few days like they had said. We decided to leave the zipper partially open so we can keep an eye on them just in case. Another hour went by, and we didn't see anything unusual. Actually, we didn't see anything at all. I guess they were just cramped up in their tent the whole time. Anyways, it was pretty dark out at this point, so we decided to call it a night and get our sleeping bags ready. I zipped the tent back up and laid down next to my girlfriend. I must have fallen asleep pretty fast though, because I didn't even remember anything after laying down. But I woke up a few hours into the night having to use the bathroom. It was still raining, so I put on one of my cheap plastic rain ponchos so that I wouldn't have to go back to bed soaked. And I headed out a few feet behind our tent and behind one of the trees. But through the rain, I could hear voices. It was really hard to tell where they were coming from though. I turned my head all around, looking in every direction as I started to get a little paranoid, but I didn't see anyone. Then I looked over at the small tent in the middle and noticed the front zipper was open. It was hard to see in the darkness and through the rain, but I was pretty sure that nobody was in there. I knew that the men had told me that they were staying the night in the tent, so this started to get me even more worried. I ran over to my tent and shook my girlfriend awake and told her about the situation. She was clearly tired, but I could tell that she was just as worried as I was. As we were discussing what to do, we both heard it. Voices coming from behind our tent. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew sitting in the tent didn't feel very safe anymore. I told my girlfriend to pack the bags quickly and be ready to leave if we had to. Then I grabbed a small pocket knife and quickly got out and looked over at the trees. I saw the two men from earlier standing there just a few feet from our tent. I remember this moment very clearly as both men looked at me with absolutely no emotion. They didn't make any facial expressions or even move at all. I knew at that moment that these men were planning on doing something horrible, and they were not scared of me at all. A second later, my girlfriend looked out of the tent, which took me out of my state of shock, and I yelled at her to go, pointing at the trail back down the mountain. I followed after her, leaving my bag in the tent behind. I looked back just as we made it to the edge of the campsite, and the two men were still standing there. They didn't even try to chase us or anything. They just stood and watched us as we ran away in total fear. I'd say we were full-on sprinting for 10 minutes before slowing down and walking quickly for the rest of the way. When we got back to the car, we saw the other parked car was still there, but the passenger door was opened again. I immediately drove us down to the nearest gas station where we called the police and were met by them a few minutes later to talk about what had happened. A few days passed by, and then we get a lot more information, and it made everything even more terrifying. When an officer went down to investigate the area, they found that the car belonged to an older man who had recently been filed as missing. All of the belongings from the car had been stolen, and they were able to confirm that the tent on the campground was the old man's as well. They didn't find the two men though, and they didn't find any real evidence other than their shoe prints. The old man wasn't found either, and as far as I know, he still has never turned up. This made my girlfriend and I both feel sick, knowing that we could have been just seconds away from something horrible. I guess we'll never know for sure what those two men were actually up to, but I think we can all make a pretty good guess based on the whole situation. But what I do know is that the image of those two men standing in front of me still haunts my memories to this day. I was lucky enough to have a job that allowed me to travel a lot in my late 20s and early 30s. I would usually only spend a couple days in one location though for work, so I was limited to how much I could actually do when I was staying somewhere nice. But I had a job out in Pennsylvania for a week and ended up finishing a day early, which meant I'd still have to stay there for an extra day before my flight. Since I never got to get out much, I figured I should use this time to my advantage and do something fun. I decided on a long trail that went through some of the pretty forests and trees here. I've always really enjoyed nature, but I felt like my job forced me to be inside buildings or planes all the time. So this was a good chance for me to enjoy the nice weather and scenery. I woke up early, but I actually had to go to the store to buy some hiking clothes as I didn't pack any with me. The trail was about an hour away from my hotel, and I ended up getting there just before 12 p.m. It didn't look like anyone else was there, which I was pretty happy about. When I looked up the trail online, it said it would take about 6 hours there and back, so this was pretty much an all-day thing. I had a little backpack with a water bottle and some snacks, so I brought that and started making my way down. The first hour was really nice. Just being alone on a path between the trees was really peaceful and a nice way to get some relief from my stressful work life. But as I was walking, I noticed a man sitting on the ground next to the path up ahead. He looked almost as though he were sleeping, with his head hanging down and a hoodie covering his face. As I started to get closer, he looked up at me, almost staring me down as I walked past him. I had no idea what to make of him, but it was a little creepy, so I continued to check behind me occasionally for the next few minutes as I continued down the trail. After a couple hours, I got a little tired and hungry, so I found a small log on the edge of the path and sat down to have a snack. I was probably there for 3 or 4 minutes before the man that I'd walked past earlier appeared down the path, making his way towards me. He was still a good distance away though, so I decided to quickly pack my bag up and continue down the trail so I didn't have to interact with them. Apparently my plan didn't work though, as only a few minutes later I heard loud running footsteps coming up behind me. I turned around and saw the man jogging in my direction. I moved over to the side, hoping he would just pass by, but he ended up stopping right in front of me. I'll admit, I was pretty nervous and felt really uneasy about this guy. He didn't say anything and reached into his pocket, and then he holds out a wallet and says, "I think you dropped this." The wallet definitely wasn't mine though, and I could tell it was completely empty too. I told him that he must be mistaken and that I didn't bring my wallet with me. He responds, telling me that he knew this was my wallet and I needed to take it back. I honestly didn't know what to do or say, but I could see in his eyes that he was getting mad. I was pretty sure this guy was trying to do some weird trick in order to rob me or something, but I didn't know what other options I had other than to just listen to the guy. So I just said, okay, and picked up the wallet from his hand. Then he looked at me in the eyes, smiled, and said, "You're welcome." Then he began making his way down the trail. I stood there for a minute, processing the interaction I just had. Then I held out the wallet and looked at it more closely. It was one of those typical brown folding wallets and looked pretty worn and old. I opened it up and checked every pocket in it, but there wasn't a single thing in there. I was so confused, I had no idea what to think, but I knew I didn't want to run into this man again, so I just started making my way back to my car. It was 4 p.m. now, and I had a little over 2 hours to go before getting back to my car. I tried my best to enjoy the walk, but I couldn't stop thinking about what happened, and it kept making me more and more nervous. I was constantly looking around to make sure he wasn't following me, but finally I could see my car up ahead. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a long shadow on everything, and my car was parked facing the trail, so I was walking towards the front of it. Once I was a few feet away, that's when I noticed a man's shadow coming from behind the car as if they were crouched down. I stopped in my tracks, staring at their shadow next to my car. I knew that running away would almost surely end badly, but I also knew that he was probably going to try and steal my car and rob me once I tried to get inside. After a few seconds, I quietly reached into my pocket to feel for my keys, then started walking towards the passenger door. I quickly unlocked the car and got in through the passenger side. I could hear the man instantly jump up and run straight through the driver's side door, but I locked it from the inside just before he tried to open it. He started banging on the window as I crawled into the driver's seat and turned on the car. I could clearly see it was the same man from earlier, and he began screaming at me to give him the wallet back. I ignored him and reversed out of there and onto the main road, where I drove away as quickly as I could. As I was pulling away, he ran back onto the path and into the trees. I guess my plan had worked, assuming it threw him off by not going to the driver's side door and gave me time to get in and lock it. There was a police station I remembered seeing on the way, so I stopped there and went inside to report the man and give them the wallet. And then I headed back to the hotel. I called one of my friends to tell them about it that night, as it was just such a crazy situation. It's pretty obvious he was either trying to rob me or steal my car. But I find myself still questioning what the purpose of the wallet was, as it didn't seem to have any real significance. Anyways, I'm just happy that I was able to make it out safely and without losing anything. I always carry a small pocket knife with me whenever I go for walks now, as you never know what crazy situations you can find yourself in. It was near the end of October last year, which always makes for the best hiking weather as it's not too high and not too cold. I had a group of friends that I'd go hiking with a lot, but most of them had jobs with no set schedules, which would make it hard to find days where we could plan a hike together. So often I'd go for some shorter hikes alone and just enjoy the peace and quiet. I had the weekend off, so I found a nice hiking and camping trail nearby and drove up there on Saturday morning. I had actually been on this trail a couple years before and had always wanted to go back. It was a loop trail, so it basically went in a big circle from the start, and it was around a day and a half long. I parked my car in a small gravel parking lot and made my way up to the trailhead. The first few miles were flat and mainly just went through grassy fields before eventually leading into a forest at the bottom of a small mountain. At this point, it was probably midday, and I was well into the forest when I saw a man walking up ahead. He was too far for me to tell at first if he was walking towards or away from me, but as I continued forward, I realized he was walking towards me. This wasn't a very popular trail, and the last time I hiked it, I don't think I saw anyone. But it was the weekend, and I figured maybe he just had the same idea as me. As he got closer though, I noticed he didn't have a backpack on. And this was pretty unusual, as I was probably 6 or 7 hours down the trail, and there was no way someone would go this far without even a water bottle. He waves at me once he's a few feet ahead. I returned the gesture to be polite, but still being cautious due to being in such an isolated area. As he passes, I hear his footsteps stop and the dirt crumble as if he turned around. I looked back and sure enough, he's facing me, and then he asks me something really strange. "Where's your group at?" I wasn't sure how to respond, as all I could really think about was whether this stranger knew that I usually had a group, or if he was just trying to figure out that I was alone. Either way, it was unsettling and made me really nervous. I responded, telling him that they were on their way a couple minutes behind me. I couldn't think of anything else to say, but I definitely didn't want this man to think that I was alone. "Good," he replied, then smiled and began walking again. I continued on in the opposite direction, further down the trail. A few hours went by, and I spent most of the time thinking about that guy and how weird the whole situation was. The fact that he didn't have a backpack so deep into the hike made the whole thing even more unsettling. I decided I'd find a good place a little ways off the main trail to set up my campgrounds just to be safe. I found a nice flat area about a half a mile from the trail and pitched my small tent. The sun was starting to set, so I sat outside my tent and just tried to stop thinking about the guy. I had a pre-packed lunch made for the trip, so I got that out and finished it before laying in the tent to try and get some sleep. I was laying there for probably over an hour, unable to sleep, before I started to hear footsteps coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze, listening to them moving towards me. I tried to reason with myself in my head that it was probably just some animal or something, but the steps were all too recognizable as a person's. It sounded like they were 15 to 20 feet away when they suddenly stopped. I waited there for what felt like hours, laying still and listening intently with my heart racing, but there were no more footsteps. I knew they had to be waiting nearby, as I would have heard the footsteps fade out if they had left. Eventually, 4 hours had passed and the sun was just starting to rise. I knew I had to get out of here at some point, and I was so tired that I was questioning if maybe I'd somehow just not heard the footsteps going away. I unzipped the tent and lifted the flap up a little to peek outside, but I didn't see anything, so I got out and looked around. It was very quiet and the trees were blocking most of my view, but from what I could see, nobody was there. After a few minutes, I cautiously packed up my tent, still looking around frequently, as I was definitely on edge and every small noise would make me jump. I attached my tent to my bag and started heading back towards the trail as quick as I could, but I only made it a few steps before noticing clear footprints in the dirt just behind a tree that was right by where I had my tent. I began panicking and didn't even look for any more footsteps as I sprinted towards the trail. I was terrified now, as I knew there was someone stalking me in the middle of an isolated forest hours away from anywhere safe. Once I got back to the path, I quickly began walking back down the way I came. It was probably quicker at this point just to continue down, but I figured that whoever was watching me would probably be waiting for me to continue that way. Luckily, nothing else happened the whole way back to my car, which I didn't get to until nearly sunset. I told my friends about the strange man and what I heard and saw, and they all said that I was lucky to get out of there without anything else happening. I contacted the police just to report the suspicious activity on the trail, but not much was able to get done about it. I'm definitely more cautious when hiking and camping though, and I rarely go without my group of friends anymore. I will never know what that guy's true intentions were, and I hope nobody else has to know either. Back in high school, my house had a huge backyard that was connected to a large forest. When we were kids, me and my friends would go and play games far out in the woods. there was always this small sense of danger being out there, which made things more fun. As we grew up though, we stopped going out there because there was no point. But then one day, me and my buddy Tyler were hanging out on the couch when he brought up this idea of going out into the woods late at night. Over the next few minutes, our idea evolved from just a simple walk in the woods to full-on camping overnight. Tyler said his parents had a tent we could borrow, so we walked down the street and picked it up from his garage. Now's a good time to mention that neither of us had ever been camping before, so we had no idea what we were doing. Honestly, I don't think either of us thought anything of it though, because we would only be out there for a single night. After packing a bag with a bunch of snacks, water bottles, and a portable phone charger, we set foot in the woods. We found out within the first couple minutes that the flashlight Tyler brought was really shitty, barely lighting up more than a few feet ahead. It was enough to keep us from walking into trees and bushes, but we couldn't see much else. During the first 15 minutes of walking, we talked about how excited we were and how creepy it was going to be. But then we walked for another 15 minutes without really talking. I think we were both mesmerized and a little bit spooked by the eerie silence. A couple times, I thought I heard something walking nearby, but the flashlight would never reach far enough to see anything. After our 30 minutes of walking, we found a place to set up. It was an open section of grass with trees around it. Tyler wedged the flashlight on top of a bush so that it lit up the area, and then we started setting up the tent. He said it was an easy assembled tent, but there was nothing easy about it. We probably spent an hour to get the tent to stand up without falling in on itself. It also didn't help that every time we'd hear something, we'd have to grab the flashlight out of the bush and shine it around, then set it back up and start over on the tent. I don't know about Tyler, but at this point, I was regretting coming out there. When we did eventually get the tent up though, it was a lot less stressful. We sat inside and listened to the sounds of the woods. It would be completely silent sometimes. Then a minute later there would be birds chirping or some other animal making noises. It was a really cool experience until we both heard a more familiar sound. We stayed in the tent, listening as these footsteps made their way around the trees. They didn't sound like they were getting closer, but more like they were passing by. One thing we were both sure of was that they were human footsteps, not any other animal. After a minute they were gone, but me and Tyler stayed quiet, staring at the inside of the tent as we listened carefully. Around 10 minutes later, once we were sure whoever that was long gone, we left the tent and sat outside instead. We both felt a little too vulnerable, sitting inside there without being able to see what was going on around us. As we sat and talked for a while, that same sound started coming up in the distance. This time, it was getting closer. It eventually got so close that we were worried they were coming directly at us. Tyler shined the flashlight in the direction of the footsteps, but the sound continued. They walked toward us slowly, and just when we thought the person would come into view of the flashlight, they stopped. They sounded so close, enough for us to hear them breathing, but just barely outside of the light. Both Tyler and I were frozen, staring at the darkness beyond the flashlight. Then we heard them take one step back, and then they began walking away. A minute later, the footsteps had disappeared, and the entire woods was silent again. We undid the tent as fast as possible and immediately left. We were so shaken up, we didn't even follow the right way home, and somehow ended up on a neighboring street. We walked down to my house and stayed up the entire night in my room, talking about what happened, or what could have happened. We never stepped foot inside those woods again, and even today, I stay far away from anywhere isolated. Whoever that person was, out there alone in the woods at night, had to be up to something awful, and I think we were really close to finding out. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of U.S. citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. I'm 28 and live in Illinois. If you've ever been here, you know this state is completely flat and doesn't have much to do in terms of hiking or camping, at least not with scenic views. This year, I tried to go camping for the first time in a secluded forest. I thought it would be the perfect starter camping trip since the land was flat and the trail was mostly a straight shot. At the end was supposed to be a small pond, so at least there would be somewhat of a nice view. The hiking part was short, being just under an hour, but the pond at the end was very underwhelming to say the least. It was very small and surrounded by swampy mush, so I had to put my tent further down into the forest where the ground was dry. I'll admit though, after an hour or two, I was really bored. I decided to get up and walk around the pond just to see what was around. I wandered to the other side, and really there wasn't much to see. It was a peaceful and beautiful forest, but there were no defining landmarks of any kind, so it was kind of just the same forest all around. I started making my way back to my camp, and by then the sun was mostly gone. I brought a small fire starter, so I used that to get a campfire going and heat up some food. But not long after sunset, I noticed a light across the pond. It was in the trees just outside of the pond, but it was right where I'd walked earlier, and I knew there was nothing there just an hour ago. While it was uncomforting being out in the forest with some stranger, or possibly strangers, I knew that this was one of few camping trails around here, so the odds of it weren't too crazy. I went about my night, looking across the pond every so often. As it got darker though, this light that I thought was a campfire became more apparent. Then I realized it was a flashlight, or some sort of mechanical light. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but an hour more into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye the light started dimming, and then after a few flickers, it went out. I stared at the dark and empty forest across the pond for a good 10 minutes, waiting for the light to come back up, but it never did. It gave me chills, but again, I had no idea what to make of it. The rest of the night was surprisingly quiet. I slept, and as far as I'm aware, nothing happened overnight. As the sun rose, I prepared for another walk. I was still thinking about that light I saw, and really wanted some answers. I walked around to the other side of the pond where I saw the light coming from and searched around. It didn't take long for me to find the culprit. A hefty flashlight laying in the grass. The batteries were drained, but it looked pretty new. No scratches or noticeable wear and tear. I looked around some more and saw nothing else to indicate someone being here. After some thought, I decided to leave the flashlight where I found it and started heading back to my camp, but stopped in my tracks when I saw someone across the pond. They were standing by my fire pit in the middle of my camp. Then I saw another person come out of the trees and join them. It looked like 2 adult men, but that's all I could tell from where I was. I was too scared to yell or say anything, so I just watched as they walked around my camp and looked through my things. Then one of them stopped and turned to face the pond. He stood there, scanning the tree line where I was standing, until he was looking right at me. He only looked at me for a moment, but it sent shivers through me. I watched the man leave the camp and start walking between the trees. I lost sight of him for a moment, until I caught a glimpse of him sprinting through the forest. I ran further into the forest, away from the pond. I knew the chances of them finding me were near zero, but I was too scared to think straight. I ran for probably 15 minutes before I stopped and turned in the general direction of my car. Luckily, I made it safely, but I lost everything I had. To put it shortly, nothing happened afterwards. I filed a report with the police, but it all turned to nothing. I think about that flashlight a lot, though. Was it those men's, or was it someone else's? I hope the flashlight was just a ploy they used to get me away from the camp, but if it was, then why would they come after me? I keep trying to convince myself that it was just a robbery and they had no other intentions, but in my gut, I know that I likely came close to never making it out of that forest. Last year was the first time I'd ever had something happen on my camping trip. I'd go camping alone several times a year, usually going to the same spots, but sometimes I'd try and find somewhere different. For this trip, I decided on a 4-mile camping trail that I'd never been on before. I drove out 2 hours from my house to a remote location where I started the hike from. Right away, I was not enjoying the trail as much as I thought I would, mainly because some portions of it were wet and muddy. Still, I continued along and tried to avoid those spots. I went down for a while, and around 45 minutes in, I saw something off the side of the trail. It was a tent, but very worn down and had a few rips in it. From afar, I could see that nobody was inside of it, so I walked closer. There were no signs of any intentional damage. It all just seemed to be weathered over a long period of time. The fact that it was still standing up was mind-blowing to me. I looked around it and inside of it, but oddly enough, there was nothing else. I thought I'd find a bunch of stuff left behind, but there wasn't anything at all other than the tent itself. After a couple of minutes, I went back to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't come up with any good reasons to leave a tent like that. As I walked for the last hour and a half of the trail, I came across dozens of left-behind objects. All of them were camping or hiking equipment, But seeing all of this stuff scattered around a 4-mile trail gave me an uneasy feeling. Who would leave everything behind? It was definitely not an accident, and I was pretty sure it was all from one person. When I got to the end, I set up my tent a good distance away from the trail just to be safe. It was getting dark already, so I stayed at my campsite until I was ready to sleep. I felt a bit nervous to go to bed, but I was able to sleep through the whole night without issue. When I got up, it was early in the morning, around 4 or 5, so the sun wasn't fully up yet. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, but right away I could tell something was wrong. I turned around, and on the other side of my tent, a man stood just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, wearing disgusting clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. He looked at me with this empty stare. I stood there motionless. In the moment, I was so shocked and scared, it almost didn't even seem real. "Leave," he spoke in a soft yet creepy tone. I nodded and quickly started gathering my backpack, but he immediately rushed toward me. I fell back, and all I could get myself to say was, "Okay," repeating it over and over. The man stood over me, still with that empty look in his eyes. "Leave," he said again. I understood what he meant this time and quickly got up and rushed away, leaving everything behind. I took one look back as I got out of there, and the man was rummaging through my backpack like a curious animal. I jogged as far as I could, then fast-walked the rest of the way to my car. Thank God I kept my phone and keys in my pocket, or this situation could have been 100 times worse. I drove out until I got service, then called 911. I found out that there was an almost identical case to what I experienced, but whoever filed it chose for it to not be publicly announced by the media. This was likely the person whose tent and belongings I found on the trail. After a week of talking to the police and going over everything, they were able to organize a small search party of officers. They went down the trail and came back with no sightings or evidence of the man, but they found most of my stuff nearby my campsite, tossed around like trash. After that, the case went stale, just like the previous person's. The thing I always come back to is how the man didn't keep anything. He just scattered it all around the forest with no intent of using any of it.